you talked a lot about the narrative and setting the narrative to the outside world. And with you being His Holiness's English interpreter, how did you go about helping find the balance between the political and the deeply personal voice in like the Dalai Lama's tone?
The word political, has to be understood in the right context, the right way, when we apply it to His Holiness's work. So, political in the sense of representing a struggle of a people and being their voice is what we mean by political here, not in the sense of party politics or politics in another sense. So, for His Holiness, my understanding is that, and in fact he says in the book, saving Tibet is a noble work, is the work of Dharma. And Dharma, Buddhist belief, is the source of happiness for all sentient beings. So I think for His Holiness, he has always said the survival of Tibet, although it is directly related to a people, distinct people, but its implication goes beyond Tibetan people. It is a survival of great Buddhist tradition, Buddhist civilization, and a compassionate culture that has evolved from the Tibetan tradition. So, for His Holiness, I don't think he sees a conflict between him being a monastic member, a Bodhisattva, whose vision is to serve humanity, and at the same time dedicated to serving the Tibetan cause. Because for him, serving Tibetan cause is a Bodhisattva work. So in that sense, I don't think there is any conflict, in him between the two. So when he's talking about certain aspects of his efforts, whether it is coming to the conclusion that he needs to change his approach from seeking restoration of independence, that was what he was focused on up until the late 60s, and then in the early 70s there is a beginning of a shift, moving more from restoration of independence to seeking some kind of meaningful autonomy and accommodation. I think in those articulation of these, you can see quite a personal voice, because he's often always said that struggle for Tibetan freedom is not about him as an individual. So when the Chinese presented him with a proposal that it relates to his status, his power, his future, his privilege, he says, no, the issue is not about the Dalai Lama, the issue is about the Tibetan people. So I think, it comes through quite powerfully, even when he's explaining difficult political processes, that he's always bringing this personal bodhisattva perspective in his understanding of that situation, because his motivation is always to help, always to benefit sentient beings. So there are specifically personal voice in certain parts of the book when he steps back in one of the chapters and talks about the practices that he finds helpful in the face of dealing with suffering. So those are very personal, but those are deliberate steps where he's taking a step back. So for example, those of you who have read the book will notice, for example, after the loss of Tibet and coming into exile, he takes a step back and he presents a geopolitical reflection. How do we understand the loss of Tibet within the broader geopolitical context of a history at the time? He talks about the fact that we were unlucky because the loss of Tibet, invasion of Tibet, happened soon after newly independent India gained its freedom. So India was not in a strong position to advocate for Tibet. US had just supported the nationalist government, Kuomintang, that was the losing side against the communists. So they were only interested in prevention of communism, not in support of the Tibetan people. The British country, United Kingdom, who has had the closest connection with Tibet because of its initial invasion of Tibet in 1904, 1903, the Young Husband expedition. His Holiness says that UK could have been more empathetic because of their historical understanding of Tibet, but they chose not to because they have just gone through the decolonization process. So the last thing they wanted was to get involved yet again in Asia. So there is a stepping back and looking at the big picture. So sometimes you see these deliberate chapters where he's stepping back and giving the big picture, at least from his side. How do we understand what has just happened? He's saying when he left Tibet, he was not in a position to understand this because there were immediate needs to save the Tibetan people, help the Tibetan who are in exile. After things settled down, he had an ability to look back. So then the chapter on dealing with suffering is another step back. It's more like a spiritual perspective on how do I deal. So His Holiness, those of you who know him well, we know he's a very practical person. He doesn't wallow too much on self-pity or sadness. He just wants to deal with the problem at hand. So I think you can see different voices in the book, some of which are much more personal, emotional, and some of which are more kind of rational. So I think it's good when you're reading, you should allow yourself to feel that. The narrative moves from personal to the reflective to more rational and so on.
Thank you, Geshe-la. And thank you for the presentation as well as your question. I do want to say that we have, I think, 8 groups and we want to get through the presentation, so we will leave the questions for the Q&A session.
Okay.
The next group has the youth leadership title, and the context for this is His Holiness took on leadership responsibilities at a very young age during a national crisis. While we don't face the same situation, Tibetan youth today are being called to step into leadership in our communities, movements, and institutions. And the question is, what does it mean to be a leader as a young Tibetan today, and why is it important? So if we can have that group, youth leadership. Okay, great.
Thank you. So my name is Sampo, and our group talks about youth leadership. What does it mean to be a leader as a young Tibetan today, and why is it important? So basically, we talked about the challenges and opportunities. So some challenges are that these days there's many things happening in the world, and a lot of people don't know about Tibet, and a lot of people never heard about Tibet, and a lot of governments, we feel like there's not much support and not much action happening. And also, we've had 7 decades of struggle, which is a really long time, and it feels like the problem is fading away. But some opportunities are that we live in a free country and there's freedom of speech, so we can express our voice and share our knowledge about Tibet and basically tell the world what's happening. And basically, to summarize what we talked about is, we said we can share our story, speak up for ourselves, be vocal, and not just about political history, but also protect our culture and learn our culture. And also, we should understand our history. That's what we talked about, and we could share to other people and tell them what's going on in Tibet and our struggle for freedom. And lastly, we said that all Tibetans are born as activists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll now move on to the next group, which is representing Tibetans inside Tibet. His Holiness has been the bridge between Tibetans in exile and those inside Tibet. He has worked hard to be the voice for those inside Tibet who cannot speak freely. Today, as surveillance and repression remain at their peak in Tibet, how do we continue to represent and stay connected with our people inside? So if we could have the group representing Tibetans. Oh, sorry.
So to address this question, we've come up with 3 umbrella points. 3 umbrella points being social advocacy, cultural preservation, and self-awareness. Under those 3, they kind of all connect in a sense. I'll just provide some specific points. Some of us mentioned advocating and spreading the word online, whether through petitions, signing bills. The preservation of culture and identity through entrepreneurship. So whether that be starting businesses, organizations, or just teaching or being involved in other organizations that are proactively engaged in the Tibetan cause. And we've also talked about diversifying our way of thinking. So it's not only about us as Tibetans, but we live in the West, and so there's a lot of cultures around us, and so we have to communicate with other cultures as well. And once we start diversifying our way of thinking, we have a broader mindset through which we can combat that Tibetan issues. And then one last thing we said was being more aware of geopolitics, because it's always shifting. And so I think the previous Sikyo had mentioned, to know Tibet is to know China. And so if we know China very, very well, then we know Tibetans very, very well. So,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll now move on to unity. So His Holiness has been a unifying force across Tibet and diaspora. He has always emphasized unity across the 3 provinces of Tibet, across generations and among those in exile and those inside Tibet. But in today's world, it's easy to become divided by politics, by language, region, and social media echo chambers. How can Tibetan youth carry that spirit of unity and build stronger communities in today's world? So if we could have the unity group, okay, great.
Hello, yeah. So we began by discussing how there's a big divide between regions in Tibet and the language that we speak, and we think that we should just be more accepting of each other, especially in America and Canada. We think there's a big fear of judgment or kind of being embarrassed to speak Tibetan because they think they don't know it enough or they can't speak it properly or they might have like an accent. So we feel that there's kind of a divide between even where Tibetan people are born, whether it's like India, Nepal, India, or even in Canada. So I think working towards dialogue is really important, and having opportunities in community centers, having platforms for Tibetans to connect, and kind of political or even government programs for Tibetan youth is important. And one of our members even mentioned when they went kind of back to their Shijak in India, they're saying the Tibetan youth in Canada are doing very well in preserving culture and language, and they even get inspired and look up to us. So I think that's something for all of us to be proud of, that at least we're trying, right? Even though we're born in Canada, we feel disconnected.
We'll now move on to shared responsibility. In the book, His Holiness says, Tibetans rely on me too much. He spent decades encouraging us to become less dependent on him and more empowered as individuals and communities. As he turns 90 this year, how can we now begin to share and step into that responsibility? It's shared responsibility. Okay, that sounds great.
We actually chose another topic. It was Tibet on the global stage. It's a poster. But I'll just say the context. His Holiness the Dalai Lama helped transform Tibet from a little-known place to a symbol of global moral leadership by connecting our struggle to wider issues like environmental protection, peace, nonviolence, justice, as well as through the promotion of Buddhism. and our topic was Tibet on the global stage. Our main question was, how do we as young Tibetans continue this work of making Tibet visible and relevant in the world today? And so our main goal we tried to tackle was how to make Tibet visible and relevant on the global stage today. And we realized that the initial problem we have to overcome is our own community engagement, our own engagement with Tibetan youth. Firstly, to allow Tibetan youth to cultivate their identity rather than repress it or, get distracted in the Western world that we are in today. We can do this by developing programs that allow Tibetans to cultivate their identity. And something that I think is really important is to encourage Tibetan youth to participate in community activism, whether that's through VTAG, Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group, or SFT, Students for a Free Tibet. I think I see a lot nowadays Tibetan youth simply saying free Tibet, but rather than participating in the local groundwork of Students for a Free Tibet or VTAG. So I think we need to encourage youth to participate in these events to cultivate their identity. Secondly, how can we allow Tibet to enter the global stage? We thought about two different mediums of this. Firstly being social media strategy, secondly political lobbying, advocating to politicians. We can do this by a really important thing that we thought about was connecting the Tibetan issue to other global issues that are happening in the world. For example, the current US administration, there's been a threat to democracy and a rise of dictatorship in the US. And what's happening is the current administration are taking away human rights, freedom of speech in the US Constitution. And we can connect that to what has been happening in Tibet for over 70 decades, the erosion of free speech in Tibet, human rights abuses, connecting that long-term Tibetan issue to the relevancy of modern day issues is key to allowing Tibet to be recentered in the global stage. And again, doing this through social media advocacy. And again, what Dr.T.Jimpa said, the most prevalent problem in the Tibetan issue is controlling our narrative. I think we can very much do this through, as today's very modern age, social media advocacy. I think as a model, as an example, is a specific Instagram account called Students for Free Tibet International. They have gained over 15 million views on their social media through strategic social media strategy. And they do this through video form and other kinds of forms. And I think, again, through relating the Tibetan issue to modern global issue and the medium through social media strategy is key to controlling our narrative in the global stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincel. Although you showed, social media advocacy and strategies that we can adopt as we move forward. We'll now go to the next group, Continuity Beyond His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His Holiness has been the heart of the Tibetan people for decades, spiritually, politically, and symbolically, but he has also prepared us for a future beyond him. What does that future look like for Tibetans and the Tibetan struggle? And what role can youth play to ensure the Tibetan movement and identity remain strong even after his time? So if we could have the group Continuity Beyond His Holiness. Oh, right here.
I think we focused more on broader ideas about preserving our culture, especially as youth. A lot of us grow up in the Western world, like Kunsel said, and it's really important for us to continue doing things like Sunday school and staying in touch with Tibetans in Nepal and India, and thinking critically and staying educated about Tibet and China and external global issues that sort of reflect what's happening in Tibet. And we should help make that education a lot more accessible for people inside Tibet and non-Tibetans as well. We also want to encourage youth to engage and take agency to build community and a new momentum after the wave of the Free Tibet movement in the 90s. It's important to keep that momentum because it was there and it can come again. Preserving culture and language, this will help us reclaim our identity and reclaim it both as a nation and as individuals, and use our privilege in the West, in exile, and our voices to speak out, be courageous, persevere, and learn, which are all qualities of a really good global citizen and advocate. And we should break silences and transform our language into action for the longevity of our community and movement beyond His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the last group, which is Buddhism and compassionate leadership. His Holiness often says, "My religion is kindness." His leadership has been deeply rooted in Buddhist values, especially compassion. In today's world, how can young Tibetans lead with compassion in ways that support both their own well-being and that of their communities?
Dr.T.Jimpa, thank you so much for spending this wonderful afternoon with us. So our prompt, or the main question is, in today's world, how can young Tibetan lead with compassion in ways that support both their own well-beings as well as their communities? We discussed that the compassion and many of Dalai Lama's teaching has helped us in our own lives. It has helped us manage anger, stress at home, and guide us in how we treat our elders, partners, and our children. That has transitioned in us being able to deal with various stressful situations in our workplace and our community. As many of us work in healthcare, we find ourselves applying a lot of our religious values and compassion in dealing with difficult patients and empathizing with their sufferings. It makes oneself and our values strong so that we can support our community. Another way compassion has helped us is help us self-reflect our values.
I'm very touched by the ways in which you have looked at different dimensions of what you see as important aspects of the message that are coming from this book. So whether it is the relationship between Buddhism and Tibetan struggle and the values that are at the heart of Tibetan tradition and identity, or whether it is the challenge of how do we maintain the struggle beyond the lifetime of His Holiness as he has helped us prepare through democratization of the system, or whether it is to do with how can youth take on the mantle and carry the struggle forward, and what does it mean to be a leader. And here I think, it is important to open up the concept of leadership, because sometimes in the Asian context, we tend to associate leadership with position and authority and status. Whereas in reality, some of the leaders never held official position. Gandhi is a powerful example. Gandhi never held office, but he was one of the most powerful leaders of a struggle and of a people. So when we think of a leader, we have to think outside the box, so that leadership need not be conferred on us as individuals. Leadership can be embraced by individuals who, one way or another, find a way to inspire their peers, and who can then inspire others to join in the movement. I don't know, some of you might have seen this beautiful YouTube where there is a demonstration of what does a leader means and what does a follower mean, and how the movement gains momentum when there is a critical mass. So leader alone is not enough. We need a imaginative, kind of an assertive voice, but you also need followers or immediate followers, which then gives a momentum. So we need to have much more sophisticated understanding of what leadership means. And one request I do have for the youth is to be smart. Constantly bombarding the world with Tibetan story is not the way to go. We lose our voice in a cacophony of noises that populate the social media world. The smart strategy is to seize opportunities. There will come opportunities. For example, when there is a major event on a global stage that has to do with China, whether it is a struggle or whether it is a visit of a major Chinese leader in town, there will be moments when a creative approach needs to be brought in. The Tibetan community remains connected with our mother hub, which is in India. So long as establishment, CTA remains in India, that will be our mother hub. Wherever we are in different parts of the world, the communities need to be connected. And then in whatever way we can in our own place, when the opportunity arises, especially for the younger generation, because elder generations are not that quick. And also, sometimes the mastery of the language comes in the way. But younger generation, you don't have that obstacle. You are swift, you are fast, you have the pulse of the culture and the time on your own. Easily you go like this. And so then if you are able to unite a voice when there is a strategic opportunity, that's how we keep it going. So that's one thing I wanted to share with you, so that we are, there is a saying, don't work too hard, but work smart. A smart strategy is way more effective than overwork, overtime work. So that's one thing I wanted to share with you, but thank you.
The goal of gaining Tibet's territory, but also keeping Tibet's cultural existence alive as a nation, as you said. Why do you think China is not listening still at this point? I was just wondering that as you were talking about middle way. Yeah, that's my big question. Why do you think China is still not agreeing to this?
Thank you. This is a really important question because, letting go of claim for restoration of Tibetan independence was a major concession on the part of His Holiness. Because the right to reclaim independence still exists on the part of the Tibetan people, because Tibet was an independent nation when it was invaded. So the moral right and the international legal right still exists on the part of the people that was invaded. So now this is why His Holiness in the book says that he is disappointed, but he's also a little baffled why a Chinese leadership did not take up on the offer he has made, the concessions he has made, because it is in the long run interest of PRC to resolve this problem in a peaceful way, because the problem is not going to go away. And His Holiness's conclusion in the book is that it's not that they did not understand what was being offered. The leadership just did not have the political will or the courage. Because it's always easier to stay with the status quo, we all know, than to be courageous and envision a different scenario. So His Holiness attributes it to that. Now, one thing we'd have to remember is, this is here I'm speaking, not from the book, I'm speaking myself, okay? People's Republic of China, and before that, the Republic of China, that came into existence after the fall of Qing dynasty was envisioned as a modern nation state. And until that point, China was an empire. Sun Yat-sen established the new Republic of China, and that all people who were involved in the establishment of the new Republic of China were deeply inspired by French Revolution. Many of them were studied in France. Okay, so there was this romantic idea of establishment of a modern nation state, and in order to accommodate the territory, during the Qing Empire, at one point, Mongol and Tibet were part of the Qing Empire, and Qing is a Manchu dynasty. It was not a Chinese dynasty, it was a Manchu dynasty. The Republic of China came up with the idea of China, modern China, as a modern nation, multi-nation state. This is the vision of China, People's Republic of China, inherited. The difference is, during the nationalist China, they did not try to forcibly make it real. PRC made it real by using force. So that's the difference. So I think it is, now this is my interpretation, it is too simplistic to read China's invasion of Tibet simply for territorial gain. There is a bigger story. That story has to do with the vision of modern China. China as a multi-nation state. That's why in the modern Chinese flag, there are 5 stars. One of the stars represents the Tibetan people. Okay, the big star represents the Han, the other stars represent Manchu, Mongols, and Uyghur. And similarly, the Republic of China, that is Kuomintang period, had a different flag that also has representations of different nations. So the history, the recent history before the invasion of Tibet by Communist China is a complicated one. So there is, on the Chinese part, there is also an emotional issue. So I don't think it's just territory. If it is just territory, it would be easier, it would be more straightforward. So there's a complexity in the history. So that's why I think, His Holiness's, the beauty and the wisdom behind His Holiness's solution is to say, okay, let's not get into the complicated history. Let's talk about the future. Everybody agrees, Chinese as well as Tibetans, that Tibetans are a distinct people. Tibetans are not Chinese. Tibetans have their own language, own religion, own culture, own area. So everybody agrees Hans, Chinese and Tibetans and Uyghurs and Mongols are distinct people with a distinct nation. So since everybody agrees on this, we can find a solution where actually we can create a modern nation state, multi-nation state, where distinct people, Tibetan, can survive and thrive. That is the power and the wisdom behind His Holiness's approach, which completely bypasses the complexity of history. Because the Chinese side is saying we need to have a similar position on history, and His Holiness is saying no. Solution of a political problem does not require that we agree on the past. We just agree on the future. And that, I think, is the great wisdom behind the middle way. And in the long run, it's in China's own self-interest. Because otherwise, they're going to have perpetually the same problem. In His Holiness's book, there is a section where he says that one lesson we learn from history is that if you keep people perpetually unhappy, you cannot expect to have a stable society. That is true. The Tibetans are never going to be happy if they are forced to be Chinese. No Tibetan, His Holiness says, no Tibetan is going to say, I'm a Chinese. Why force the identity of a Chinese people on the Tibetans? There's no need for this. So I think the problem is going to remain. It's going to be one of those intractable, unsolvable problems for a long period of time. And it is our job to make sure that it remains that way until the resolution is found. You know, I have often said in my Tibetan talks, China has eaten Tibet, but it hasn't digested Tibet. And our job is to make sure it never digests Tibet. So that in a simple way, that's our struggle.
We'll have one more question.
Session. And my name is Nima Dolma. I'm one of the Tibetan girl who came from Tibet at a very young age. So yeah, I couldn't see my parents since then, and now they are no more, right? So based on that, now I'm gonna ask you one question related with the Tibetan democracy. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has generously offered democracy to the Tibetan people and try to encourage our people for the participation and equality and shared responsibility. However, in practice, a democratic process within Tibetan communities often appear influenced by social bias, regional loyalty, or groupism. In light of His Holiness' vision of genuine and inclusive democracy, what is your advice to help overcome these divisions and ensure that our democratic culture truly reflects the value he upholds? Thank you so much.
It reminds me of a saying in a Tibetan text, a Kadampa master, who says that if human beings don't fight with another human being, who else can they fight with? So, quarrel and arguments and disputes are very human behavior. But I do agree, and personally too, I'm actually quite sad to see sometimes the length to which this division and disunity actually can go to the point where sometimes our parliament in exile becomes paralyzed. There doesn't seem to be any solution to certain problems. But my own sense is, in a sense, at the moment we have a kind of a luxury because His Holiness has established our institutions in exile in such a secure way that nobody feels that we are facing an existential threat. If there is a collective threat of the very survival of Tibetan community becomes obvious, I don't think we will be squabbling like right now. So let's hope we don't have to wait until that point before we start coming together in some kind of unity, because everybody's ultimate aspiration is the same. It's the restoration of freedom to our people and high degree of meaningful autonomy for our nation. That is the aspiration of everybody. So then why waste so much time fighting about this or that? And so in a way right now, to be honest, for me it looks like people are a little spoiled. There's a kind of a lack of taking responsibility seriously, and there's a kind of a luxury because they feel that it doesn't matter that much. There's not much at stake. Maybe not now, but there might come a time where if our disunity is not resolved, the very survival of CTA and the Tibetan established community institutions in India and exile might be called into question. And at that time, it will be too late. And we would have done a great service to PRC by shooting ourselves. So that's one thing I worry. But my hope and my sense is that I don't think we will get there. I think at some point, the saner minds will prevail. There will be a unity because we can't afford disunity. It's just, we are such a small community. There's a Tibetan saying, "Mi baragam." Our community is just a baragam, we're only one handful. And even that, fighting among ourselves, is just looking from outside. It looks so stupid. So I hope that saner minds will prevail. And my own hope is that important voices like teachers and lamas and leaders would advise that we need to rise above our differences and to think of the common goal. And this is one area. Sometimes I do feel sad that His Holiness at his age, after all the efforts he has made, what he is seeing doesn't look that good. And this is like kind of a total disrespect to the legacy of your parents. So I do sometimes feel sad that at the moment there is this, but I hope this is only temporary. I hope this is not the norm. If this is the norm, we have a huge problem. And if that is because our charter is not making it possible to change, then we need to change the charter. Charter is designed by people, and if people don't have the authority to change the charter, when it doesn't work, then what's the point of charter? Charter is not a religious text. Charter is not Buddha's words that cannot be changed. Charter is not God's will. So if nothing works, then people will have to rise and revise the charter, so that at least we could have a working system. So I hope it wouldn't get there. I hope people are wise enough to know that in the end, if the community collectively suffer, everybody suffers. So I just hope that saner minds will prepare and wisdom will come through, and then teachers and voices, important voices, will advise so that the voice of unity will be stronger than the voice of disunity. That's my hope. So before we end, why don't we all together join in this very simple prayer, long life for His Holiness, okay? Kari Rave Kove Shilam Penda Dewa Malu Joen Chere Sawa Tenguji Toshije.